Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 24th of June 1923, the dangers of cultural appropriation, the noise of London, the gates of Windsor, and, in an article that will send shivers down the spines of all decent people, a man thinks he has the answer to London transport. But first, the headlines. Or more accurately, the headline. And the headline this week is that Mount Etna in Sicily, if you didn't know, has erupted. Don't seem to be an enormous number of casualties. In other news, as you are probably aware, Northern Ireland now has a devolved government, and they are using their powers wisely, and they've banned drinking on Sunday. There has been a complaint lodged by senior Labour politicians about the number of Glasgow evictions, or the number of evictions in Glasgow. Now, what's going on here, as I keep mentioning, this is an age of rent control, and one of the very few ways a landlord can put up the rent is if a tenant gets into arrears, he can have him evicted and then he can put the rent up. So this is what's going on here. There's also some correspondence about miners' pay. There is a regional minimum wage in operation, and that is obviously one that's set by the government. And because there's deflation, there's some talk about reducing it, and the miners are dead set against that, which means that prices in relative terms are going to have to rise. I think they better be careful about that. You raise the price of your product too much and one day you find that you're out of a job. One of the interesting things is in this article they did talk about the average earnings of miners, and these ranged from £107 a year to £162 a year. Which works out, according to my calculations, the higher number works out at 32 ounces of gold a year, which sounds pretty good. Of course, you have to apply the Crozier fudge factor, which is divided by 2, which is 16 ounces of gold a year, which is still pretty good, especially when you consider that this number applies to all employees, which is, as the Times puts it, men, youths and boys, and presumably boys don't get paid much at all. So my assumption is, or my belief based on this, is that the sort of fully grown miners, of the sort who go down the pit and get their faces blackened, earn quite good money. There was an interesting stat which came out of the mouth of a judge. The case was one where a landlady had let a room or a house to a tenant, I think it was a couple, without informing them that it had previously been occupied by her husband, who died of tuberculosis. Naturally, they weren't very happy about this, but the judge said this, which I found it interesting anyway, that 1 in 7 people in 1923 die of tuberculosis. I find that staggering, or at least I did find it staggering when I first came across it, and it certainly makes you wonder at how tenuous life must have been at the time. On the London stage, there's a new play biographical play about the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. There's nothing particularly interesting about it, except for one of the characters is played by one Claude Rains. If you don't know who he is, he was the very dodgy policeman in Casablanca, or he played that part. And if you don't know what Casablanca was, well, certainly when I was young, it was perhaps the most famous film there was. I think it was rivaled by perhaps Gone with the Wind, and I think it's still worth watching. Yeah, definitely still worth watching if you get the chance. Some good news out of Germany. It is no longer compulsory for German officers to submit to duels when requested. And in the photos section, there's a page in the Times of photos. I don't propose to put this up because I'm not quite sure about the copyright rules. I mean, who knows? But there was a photograph. This is from Bulgaria of government troops who had arrested a bunch of policemen in Sofia. Presumably they thought they were loyal to the Stamboliski regime, which was toppled last week. But the caption included the phrase, something to the effect of, "These men are being marched off to a concentration camp," which just illustrates how that phrase has changed its meaning since then. It didn't have anything like the same sinister connotations. They say worse things happen at sea. And they're not wrong. This is from Wednesday the 20th of June. First-class stokers Cox, Race and Dillon of the Centurion have succumbed to their injuries. They were given an impressive funeral this morning. What injuries, I wonder? Maybe we'll find out. The inquiry held by the magistrate has ascertained that during the war dance, a man stoked the fire with a spear to which a tassel was attached. This became ignited, thus causing the accident. Oh, goodness, now what's going on here? It continues. The accident referred to occurred during the sports held... Right. The sports held by members of HMS Centurion on Saturday. A party dressed as Red Indians... I shouldn't laugh. You'll get a comment, "Oh, that was my great-granddad." Anyway, a party dressed as Red Indians danced around a fire. The tow round the waist... A tow is a piece of cloth. Round the waist of one of the men took fire, and the man, losing his presence of mind, rushed among his comrades, setting two of them on fire. That was His Majesty's ship. And now for His Majesty's gates. This is from Friday, the 22nd of June. A remarkable accident occurred during Wednesday night at the double gates in the long walk between Windsor Castle and George III's statue. In accordance with usual custom, the gates had been locked and chained at the customary hour in the evening. A vehicle, thought to be a motor car, going towards Windsor, crashed into the closed gates and smashed them to pieces. I mean, you do have to wonder what on earth is going on here. I'm actually relatively familiar with this part of the world. First of all, the Long Walk is a dead straight walk from Windsor Great Park to Windsor Castle, which I think is 2 or 3 miles long. But it's bisected by a road. I think it's Albert Road. But the point being that if any gates there, I really don't know if there are any or not, would be at right angles to the road. So how a car has managed to hit these gates and smash them, well, it's anyone's guess. Anyway, it goes on. A few minutes afterwards, the motor car had disappeared. Temporary measures were taken to block up the gateway to prevent deer straying from Windsor Great Park into Windsor. I've never seen a deer at Windsor Great Park, and I'm there quite a lot, so I wonder if that's a change. Crown workmen were hurried to the spot, and in a short time new gates had been placed in position. Wow, well that's pretty impressive. Is that the statement they manufactured these gates? If so, presumably out of wood. Or is it the statement that they had some spare for just this sort of eventuality? Sort of thing the royal estate would do. It goes on. A few hours before the occurrence, the royal procession from Ascot had passed through the gates on its way to Windsor Castle. The gates were very substantial, and how a motor car could crash through them without suffering serious damage is a mystery. The road is a private one to the castle, and no motor cars are allowed down it. Well, you're not kidding. These days, there is a sign up there saying, "No cycles, wheeled or otherwise." On Wednesday the 20th, the Times published a letter from a lady Cousins Hardy. She takes us into a London very different from the present day. No one who has had an operation in the house. Yeah, I should point out, in those days it was very frequent to have operations outside hospitals. She goes on, and a patient to whom quiet and rest are everything, but wishes that a society, such as a noise abatement society recently advocated, and presumably which will come into existence fairly soon because I've certainly heard of it, existed for procuring less noise in our streets. What with the hydrant covers that never fit and make a big thumping noise as the wheeled traffic passes over them, the hideous noise of the open exhaust valves of cars, and then last but not the least painful, the music of itinerant players of all kinds of instruments. On Friday the 22nd, the Times published an article by a special correspondent all about London transport. The traffic problem in London is again being forced upon the attention of the government, and it is clear that unless some action is taken, soon the congestion in the streets will become intolerable. He offers absolutely no evidence that this is the case. Certainly London is in these days subject to jams, but then again it's subject to jams nowadays. Anyway, he goes on. London is the only metropolitan city in the world in which the facilities for local transport are allowed to go unregulated and uncontrolled, as opposed to all those unmetropolitan cities, I suppose. Perhaps an alternative conclusion could be reached, is that London is the biggest city in the world, and maybe that's because local transport is unregulated and uncontrolled, as he says. Well, of course, it is controlled by some people, just not the government, which obviously this correspondent would prefer it to be. He goes on. London has an advantage over other metropolitan cities in possessing 4 distinct means of transport: tubes, electric railways, chiefly underground, motor omnibuses and tramways. Note that he draws a distinction between tube railways and electric railways. And all these 4 are coordinated and run as a whole, except in the case of the competitive tramways and omnibuses. I'm not quite sure what he means here. I think what he means is that in the case of buses, omnibuses, and tramways, they use the roads, whereas obviously the railway operators both run the trains and maintain the track. I think that's what he means, but I could be wrong. He then starts to talk about some of the problems that London faces. Many new omnibuses are already on the streets belonging to small companies and individual owners. They are the forerunners of a large army. They are a law unto themselves, their own traffic authority. They can ply on streets already overcrowded and follow up the pioneers on new profitable routes. The result is increasing congestion, while no more passengers are carried. Every week there are cases before the police courts against drivers of rival omnibuses for obstructing, racing or blanketing each other. I think the argument about congestion is really tenuous. While I would probably accept that in the 1920s there were buses made up a greater proportion of London traffic than they do nowadays. I think that's right. I could be wrong. Buses are still a small proportion, certainly in comparison to vans, lorries, private motor vehicles, taxis. Those are the things that cause the congestion. So this is nonsense. He then talks about obstructing racing or blanketing each other. I did mention a case, this is from the 8th of April, that sort of thing going on. This is the sort of thing that you always hear when people say that buses ought to be state-owned. There was a very good podcast. It was the Econ Talk podcast, and it featured Michael Munger. This is from about 10 years ago, in which he talked about what happened in Santiago, Chile. For years, they'd had a free-for-all things worked very well, but they did have things like this business of obstructing racing or blanketing. So the politicians said, "Oh, we'll get rid of this and we'll run the buses," and the result was pretty disastrous. The correspondent then complains about tram bus competition, and he talks about attempts to solve the problem, including this. In 1920, a select committee of the House of Lords declined to give the London County Council power to run omnibuses. When I read that, I thought, "Oh, this is good. This is good news." But it turned out it wasn't because they didn't think they could run them, or were not proper people to run buses, but it was for some other reason which I can't quite remember. And then the London County Council chips in with this. The competition that is now going on between the council's tramways and the different transport undertakings comprised in the underground group serves no useful purpose. It entails serious financial risks to the ratepayers of London and the shareholders in the competing private companies, without offering any commensurate advantages to the public. I love their concern about the shareholders of competing private companies. I'm sure they really mean it. But it's this idea that competition serves no useful purpose. Oh, yes, it does. Competition is how we find out what services should be provided and by what means. It is absolutely a good thing. Of course, our correspondent here will eventually get his way. In 1934, the London Passenger Transport Board will be set up and will run all the tubes, all the electric railways, as he puts it, all the trams and all the omnibuses. Was it a success? Not really. I mean, yes, they got their roundel, which is a great logo, I think, all over the place. But other than that, certainly by the time I was sort of using it on a regular basis, the services were irregular, frequently delayed. The trains and buses were dirty, vandalised, and it often made losses as well. Not much to write home about at all. And yet, still people think it's a good idea. Who knows? Anyway, that's all for this week. I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.